Okay. Great. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My inclination is to say good evening because it is 10 o'clock at night here in Israel. But welcome to you all, most of you, and it's daytime. Thrilled to see you, many friends, many people who have who I know well, and people who have been with us on these programs before as part of Inspiration from Zion. For those who are new or who may be watching this later, my name is Jonathan Feldstein. I have the privilege of serving as president of the Genesis 123 Foundation. This program is one of the series that we launched last year called Inspiration from Zion, in order to provide you opportunities to connect with people who you might not even get to meet if you were here, but certainly for the last year, we haven't had any tourism. We certainly hope that you'll be able to come back soon and visit us. But even here, there are sometimes tremendous people here in Israel who fall through the cracks as far as tourists coming. And tonight we have one of them, although he's someone who falls through the cracks a little bit less. The Genesis 123 Foundation has as its mission to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new and unique and meaningful. And this is one of the programs. We have a whole series last year, just today's date. Yeah, today we were supposed to be running the Jerusalem Marathon as part of the Run for Zion program. That was all canceled. We've got a tremendous program called Verses for Zion to connect Christian children with Israel through studying biblical verses relating to Israel. If you have children or grandchildren for whom that's relevant, please be in touch. Don, nice to see you from Dallas. I'm glad you're okay. We have this program, Inspiration from Zion, and I actually was really busy this week, so I didn't have a chance at the end, but I'm going to give a pitch to, we don't have slides to show you, but we just now finalized the 4 segments beginning next week of the global Passover prayer for Israel, which I really want to encourage you to join. It's going to be tremendous, and I don't have slides to share the details with you, but be in touch and sign up for all 4 of them. Each one's going to be better than the next. Again, please use the chat feature. I'm attempting to follow also on Facebook, and so if people have comments, we will be looking for you there and in Zoom, and anyone, and we're going to definitely do a Q&A at the end, and ask everybody just to, during the course of the program, to please keep themselves muted. But just for last commercial pitch, just for your own information, if you're not familiar with the other programs that we have and things that are continuing to come on board, definitely visit us and stay in touch through our website, genesis123.co. Now, Ashley Perry, full disclosure, is a friend, a neighbor. We live not just in the same town, but in the same neighborhood, although 2 months ago I moved up the hill and see him even less than I used to see him. He's got one of these bios that you feel it's compelling to read all of it because it really is that compelling. I'm not going to do that because I think actually, in many ways, he speaks for himself, but let me give you just a couple of the very important highlights. Ashley is an international strategic communications consultant and public relations advisor to business leaders, governments, companies, organizations, and individuals all over the world. He's very tasteful in the sense that I never know 100% who his clients are, and I appreciate that discretion. But I know that that we're talking about some really significant people. Ashley was an advisor to Israel's foreign minister and deputy prime minister for 6 years, from 2009 until 2015. And in that context, he's also worked with, I'm not going to read all of the government ministries because it's just one long list of government ministries, but I would argue that perhaps he's worked with most of the government ministries here in Israel, with the exception of the current government, because there are so many extra ministries that were created to form the current and recently failed government. One thing that impresses me about him that honestly I didn't know until he sent me his bio is that Ashley was named one of the top 50 immigrants from the United Kingdom in Israel who have made a significant contribution to Israel, and we've had many. And if that's the case, I'm really quite impressed. He was a delegate to the World Zionist Congress, and one thing, actually, if there's time tonight, maybe just to talk about it, or maybe we'll have you back to talk about your role as CEO of the Heritage Center for Middle Eastern and North African Jewry. Ashley is a frequent public speaker. Just before we began this program, he was talking to me about the other 4 webinars that he's been involved in all over the world this week. He's been employed by many leading international Jewish and Zionist organizations, advocacy groups, and spoken and written for them on a number of topics. He's got a BA in history from University College in London and a master's in government from the IDC Interdisciplinary Center here in Herzliya, Israel. I have to say, all of that is impressive, and as we have Ashley join us and actually speak and share a little bit, you'll see why, that there's much more to it. But I think the thing for me personally, why it was really instinctive to invite Ashley to join us today, is that when I lived down at the bottom of the hill and before the pandemic, which prevented us from going to synagogue on a regular basis, I have to say, actually, I never even said this to you, but I really always looked forward to Friday nights when you and I were both in the same country, and you would stroll in a little bit later and sit down a seat or two next to me, and we would speak over my son, or I would change seats with him. And not just because Ashley's nice and personable and always engaging, but tremendously insightful. There wasn't a time that I would sit with Ashley Perry in the middle of our worship service and whisper back and forth a little bit of stuff that I didn't come away feeling some great insight. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to that you will be able to experience some of that here as well. So Ashley, welcome. Thank you for taking time in general and specifically late at night tonight. I have a lot of questions for you, and I know our guests, our friends here who are watching do. I think one of the ways to start off is the fact that most people watching now are American, if not North American, and very few have experience with our form of government here in Israel as a parliamentary democracy. So it's really foreign for a lot of our viewers today, right now. And in addition, you come from Britain. We've been here about the same length of time, I think. But the Israeli parliamentary democracy is even different from the British parliamentary democracy. Could you give a quick overview as to what the similarities, differences are, and how that plays out here?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good to see everyone here, and good evening from Israel. Yeah, I mean, there's many different political systems around the world. I've worked with many myself. Israel is what's called, first of all, it's a parliamentary democracy, as you said. Parts of Israeli politics, the legal system, is based on the British system. As we know, before the State of Israel, the land was under British mandate, so a lot of the pre-state Zionist leaders certainly incorporated some of what they'd learned from the British mandate. But one major way that it differs, apart from it being a parliamentary democracy, is that we use what's called proportional representation in Israel. In America and in England, in Canada, Australia, various places in Africa, Asia and elsewhere, basically it's the country is split up into regions, and in each region is represented by at least one member of the legislature, sometimes more, as in the US example. But basically, whoever wins that seat goes to the legislature, and all the other votes for the losing candidate basically get thrown away. Right, that's the way it is in most places. In Israel, we have one regional constituency, that's the whole of the State of Israel, and basically almost every vote counts. What I mean by that is we have a 120-seat legislature, which is based on the ancient Sanhedrin, 120 seats, and that's basically how it works. Is that if you receive 20% of the votes, your party, we have party lists here, you don't vote for a person or a president or a prime minister, you vote for a party. and each party has their own list. And if you get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of the seats. It's, to a certain extent, as simple as that, to a certain extent. We do have a threshold. It was raised a few years ago, which is 3.25, which means that any party which receives less than 4 seats will not pass the threshold, and those are the only votes that will be thrown away, which is the minority of votes, obviously, because the vast majority of votes go to parties which will pass the threshold. You'll see behind Jonathan this strange sort of white piece of paper. Each of these symbols, for those who read Hebrew, each of those, the way you vote is you basically get a sort of box with all these options, and you choose the one that represents your party, usually identifiable by 1, 2, or 3 Hebrew letters, and you put that in an envelope, and that's your vote. As I said, the majority of parties, you can see there's about 30 parties, 36 parties, 40 parties. Usually only about up to 12 or 13 parties actually pass the threshold. The overwhelming majority of parties will get a few hundred votes, a few thousand votes, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40,000 votes. But as I said, the majority of votes will be counted, and then it will, the Knesset, the legislature, will basically be broken up according to the proportion of those votes. What that does mean, it's very complicated. Basically, just to give a little bit of history, at the early years of the state, there were very many different communities: Arabs, Jews, ultra-Orthodox, religious Zionists, left, right, communists, this, that, and the other. And what the people who created the system wanted to do is make sure that everyone has a say, everyone is represented. So that was the idea. If we look throughout history, no party has ever received a majority on their own, which would be 61. 61 obviously would be a majority in 120 seat legislature. So what we have is, after the elections on Tuesday, we have what's really the interesting thing is the coalition negotiations. Basically, as I said, no party, I believe, has even received over 50 seats, I think, or at least not for many decades. And so they'll have to basically go to other parties, and together they'll get over 61, usually quite a bit over 61, or as you can imagine, the closest to 61, it becomes a little bit unwieldy. So after the votes are tallied next week and the number of Knesset seats are apportioned, the president, which is a more ceremonial position in Israel, not like the US, invites all the leaders of the different parties to say who they would select to be prime minister, and whoever has the easiest path to be able to form that government would then be given 28 days with an extension of 14 days to be able to do so. And that's really when things get interesting. Usually in Israel throughout the years, there's been what's called variously a right-wing religious bloc and a left-wing, a little bit more secular bloc. There is obviously Arab parties, but they've never been part of any government in the history of the state. But in recent years, certainly the right-left divide has certainly not as relevant, and especially now, I would say, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of coronavirus, when the economy, is obviously very challenging and everything that's gone on for a year, the right-left divide, which is usually on issues of security, diplomacy, Palestinian, two-state solution, against it, for it, whatever, that's usually the divide. It's not necessarily on economic lines as it is in many other countries. But in these elections, certainly, there's right-wing parties on both sides of the aisle, let's say. And it's more about, I would say these elections are more about personalities. Quite simply, we have a prime minister who's been in power now for 13 years. And so this was consecutively. Yeah, he also had a few years in the 90s. And it's more of a referendum on the continuation of Prime Minister Netanyahu. That's really the major overwhelming issue that most Israelis are looking at, whether you're for or against. Obviously, there are, as I said earlier, there are more sectarian parties, whether it's the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party, which is the Central and Eastern European section of Jewry, or the ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party, which is the Mediterranean, North African, and the Middle East group. As I said, there's a Russian party which is used to be at least more catered towards the Jews who came from the former Soviet Union. As I said, there's the Arab parties, but then the rest are not necessarily sectarian and more ideological oriented. Is that a good introduction?
No, that's excellent. And I know, but for many of you who are following this, you have a sense of what Ashley is talking about. If there are questions, as I said before, just please put them in the chat. We'll try and dig down, but there are a lot of other questions, and I hope that we a lot of time for conversation, and I hope that we'll draw some of it out. But definitely, please put any questions in the chat. So Ashley, excellent summary, and it's still complicated. It's really it's complicated. You do this kind of for a living, but for those of us who are involved, there's still so many pieces that we don't fully understand, and that's even on this hyper democracy of fourth election now next week in 2 years. You spoke about this election, especially being a referendum on the current Prime Minister Netanyahu. We'll probably interchange between calling him Netanyahu and Bibi in our conversation because that's his nickname that he goes by. But based on what you said, it certainly seems like not only is this a referendum on him, but it actually it appears, according to the polls, that there's the greatest challenge on the domination of him and the Likud party that he represents, certainly in the last 2 years, and arguably maybe in the last decade. What do you think about that, and why that is, especially now?
Well, the first thing I should say, as someone who works in politics, campaigns, there is really no equal, I would say, almost anywhere around to Prime Minister Netanyahu as a campaigner, as a politician. Really, the fact that he's been in power, as Jonathan said, in a hyper democracy where we're having elections in Israel, we have elections on average every 2 years. Now we're having 4 in the last 2 years, so it's even further. We don't have set terms, and government can fall from one day to the next. So to keep a coalition going involves a lot of work. It involves, you've got sometimes very competing interests. Prime Minister Netanyahu always likes to frame himself as very right-wing, as someone who stands up for Israel's security and stands against Palestinians, Iran, etc., etc. But in almost every single one of the coalitions that he's had in the last 13 years, he's had to sort of drag someone across the aisle from the left-wing camp, whether it's former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, Yair Lapid. In the last elections, it was Benny Gantz. So arguably, and this is, I think, a very important point in our system, is Netanyahu doesn't win elections. He wins the coalition. What I mean by that is he and even his bloc never received the 61, or rarely received the 61 that they need to form a government. So then what he has to do is he has to really negotiate, cajole, if you want to be unfair, bribe, pull people across, threaten into his coalition. And he's been very successful in doing that because he's prepared to pay an extremely high price. In the last government, he paid arguably the highest price. He was prepared, at least, although no one really thought it was going to happen, to step down after 2 years and then allow the alternate Prime Minister, Benny Gantz, to take over the Prime Ministership. I think Benny Gantz was probably the only one in the country who believed that would happen. But the fact that he gave a relatively small party, not only an alternate Prime Minister, a defense ministry, a sort of equal number of votes in the security cabinet and various other places, shows that he's prepared to pay an extremely high price for stability, for the continuation of his regime. And I think, it really brings into stark sort of reality that today on the political map, almost every single party has a position on Netanyahu, whether they'll sit with him or they won't sit with him. The funny thing is, or not funny, depending on where you stand, is that even those who say they won't sit with him, many of them will. In the last elections, we had this very remarkable scene of the leader of the Labour Party, historically the largest party in the 50s and 60s up until the late 70s. The leader of the Labour Party, Amir Peretz, who used to have one of these sort of very big bushy moustaches, and he shaved it off for TV and said, "I'm shaving it off so you can read my lips. I will never sit with Bibi Netanyahu." And there he was, sitting in the coalition with Bibi Netanyahu after the coalition. So a lot of Israelis are a little bit, cynical about this process. But today, apart from one or two parties, almost every party has said, "I will sit with Netanyahu or I won't sit with Netanyahu."
So that actually leads to a question I wanted to ask you, especially because Amir Peretz of Labor said that, and for anyone who's not following, Amir Peretz fell on his sword and is no longer leader of the Labor Party, and Benny Gantz as well, who came in as alternate prime minister. Do you think, Ashley, that having one person whose political career is probably over, again, Amir Peretz, and Benny Gantz, who may or may not make it back into the Knesset as the head of the Blue and White Party, do you think anyone will cross, who has figuratively shaved their mustache so we can read their lips, and they've said, no, we're not going to sit with in a government under Netanyahu, will change their mind after the election next week?
I could just tell you what I'm hearing. I'm in the Knesset once or twice a week, and I ask a question of almost every single member of Knesset, member of parliament that I meet from the left and the right. And I ask them, do you think Saul will not sit with Netanyahu? I've yet to meet a single person who says, I believe he'll stick to his word.
Wow.
I have some good friends who work with Gideon Saar, and they'll swear 1,000 times he will not sit with Netanyahu, but I haven't found a single MK, a member of Knesset, who believes that. Lapid has sat with Netanyahu. Lieberman has certainly sat with Netanyahu, although he did, arguably he was the one who led to this whole process. Correct. Because he refused to join the government, which would have given Netanyahu a comfortable 66 back last year in the first elections, because there was simply no compromise from the ultra-Orthodox side on an issue. At that time, the issue was about enlistment in the army. Those who know Israel knows that every Israeli is supposed to serve in the army 2 or 3 years. The Arab population is allowed not to serve, and the ultra-Orthodox community have a blanket exemption. Well, Avigdor Lieberman of the Israel Beiteinu, which, as we said before, was started as a party from Jews from the former Soviet Union, has long since wanted to end that arguably discriminatory process. So that's really what that issue was back then, and that sort of got this whole process moving. So not to say that it's just about personality politics. There are issues involved, but definitely at this point, it is a matter of where you stand on Netanyahu's continuation or not. And obviously in that, we've got to throw in the criminal trials, which have already started and will begin in earnest after the elections, where he's probably going to have to sit in court 2 or 3 times a week, possibly. Definitely, it was a boost for him that the trial didn't start before the elections. But that's also something to take into account. Although, judging by many people who understand the legal system better than I, they say that this process could take years, with appeal after appeal after appeal either way. So definitely, the issue of this election is where you stand on Netanyahu as continuing as prime minister or not.
Great. Now, that the moment, it's kind of hard to keep up with all of the polls, and it'll be nice when those are over and we actually see results. But based on the polls, more or less, there's a small margin of error. We're showing a stalemate. We're showing, and we'll come to the later on, I think, maybe have a conversation about who can change that stalemate. But basically, if it is possible to form a government, and if it's not Likud and Netanyahu getting 61 plus seats to do so, seems that there are possibly 3 others who might be able to do so. And I'm just going to give a little bit of background. Feel free to add or edit my comments. Those 3 in current polling order are Yair Lapid, who heads a party called Yesh Atid, There Is a Future, who's polling several seats. Their party is polling several seats beneath the Likud party. You have Naftali Bennett, who heads a party called Yamina, right of, Yesh Atid is a centrist left party. Naftali Bennett, who heads the Yamina party, which is polling at about 11, 12, 13 seats, somewhere in that.
Nine to 9.
Oh, was it 9 recently? I didn't know that. Okay, good. Thank you for that update. And he and the party tend to also be to the right. And Ashley mentioned New Hope and Gidon Sar specifically, who broke away from Likud after 20 years. And by the way, both Naftali Bennett and Gidon Sar used to be, as well as a Victor Lieberman, who you mentioned as the head of Yisrael Beitenu, were all close to Netanyahu at various points, and they all broke away from him at various points. Gidon Sar, who's also right of center and running, and the party's also polling in the upper single digits, low double digits area. What do you see as the possibility, and or what would it take for any of them to be able to form a government?
Well, I said on another webinar, I think it was last night, and I believe this, that these elections will be decided by thousands of votes, because we have around 4 parties which are really, really close to the electoral threshold. I talked about that earlier. The electoral threshold is 3.25%, which is a minimum of 4 seats. At the moment, there are 4 parties which are in and around those 4 seats. If one of them or 2 goes below the threshold, or if they all go above the threshold, the whole map changes. Because you can imagine the difference from a block, 4 seats, when we're talking about, because at the end of the day, we're talking about, as Jonathan, as you said, we're talking about a near parity between the pro-Bibi bloc and the anti-Bibi bloc. So 4 seats that won't pass the threshold on one side or the other completely changes the map. What is happening, and we've seen the last few days, and tends to happen because, as I pay tribute to Bibi before, he is an excellent politician, and he's starting to take a few seats away from both Gidon Sar and Naftali Bennett, which is very important if he's going to possibly have a chance to get to that magic number 61. What could happen after elections? The problem with the, let's say, the anti-Bibi camp is that, to a certain extent, is the only uniting principle around that camp, because you have parties, let's say Meretz, which is a far left party, and then you have Yamina, which is a right. There is a more extreme right, but let's say it's a right-wing party. You have a religious party. You have a, let's say, a less positive towards religion parties in there. So they would all have to sit under really one umbrella, which was just to stop Netanyahu continuing to be prime minister. So how would that look? How would you even entertain coalition negotiations? Because you have to come up with a coalition agreement which designs certain policies which is going to move forward in the next few years. It could be that maybe they'll just get together, form a government, push Bibi out, although again that's not a given, and then maybe go to new elections or something like that. Who's going to be the leader of that bloc? Well, that all depends. For example, Victor Lieberman, who we spoke about, said, for me, it's simple. Whoever has the largest amount of seats in that bloc gets to be my prime ministerial candidate. Others say no. What we're seeing at the moment in that bloc, the largest party is Yesh Atid, polling around 20 seats. Then you have these 2 right-wing parties that Jonathan mentioned, Yamina, Naftali Bennett's Yamina, and Gidon Sar's New Hope. There's talk of, and I know it's more than talk, that after the elections, that they could join together as a bloc if they get more than Yesh Atid and say, well, now we're the larger party than you. So the larger amongst us will then be the prime ministerial candidate. It's a little bit complicated. And if you think about it, it would even be quite bizarre to think that we could have a prime minister with only less than 10% of the whole number of seats in the Knesset. But it is a possibility. I don't discount it, but I think it's more likely that Netanyahu, maybe I'm giving a little bit away now, maybe this is for later in the conversation, but I wouldn't bet, you never bet against Bibi. That's the bottom line, because he's a wily fox. He knows how to play this game better than anyone else. You talked about all these people who are basically crashed and burnt when they've had to deal with him. He knows how to deal with everybody. He knows how to break other careers, and no one has the longevity and the staying power that he does, because quite simply, he's playing chess and they're playing checkers. Everyone else is a tactician, he's a strategist. He knows exactly what works best, how to get in people who promise not to sit with him. He's prepared to offer literally half of the country just to ensure that he gets his 61 and he retains his seat on Balfour Street, which is the seat of the Prime Minister's residence. That's why a lot of people don't like him for that very reason, but a lot of other people respect him, and he does engender that sort of love and support. In the last few days, I follow his page on Facebook, and I'm getting, I think, reminders every 2 hours that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going live on Facebook, and he goes up and down the country. Obviously, a lot of it is carefully prepared, manicured, everything like that. But there's people, they call them Bibistim. They're basically people who would vote for Bibi no matter what the situation. You hear on the news these people whose jobs have been lost, whose businesses have broken down, and they say it's all because of the government, and then they say, who are you going to vote for? Well, I'm going to vote for Netanyahu. So there's a certain amount of that aura around him. Israelis are a very conservative people with a small c, meaning that it's the better the devil you know than the devil you don't. In Israel, you can make a comeback 100 times. We've seen it with Tzipi Livni. We've seen it with Ehud Barak. We saw it with Shimon Peres. We saw it with Yitzhak Rabin. The list is endless. In Israel, there is no end of a political career because you can always come back, because the Israeli public, perhaps because of our security issues, perhaps because for decades we didn't know what tomorrow would bring. So we preferred the faces that we knew. And you can see it across the gamut in entertainment, in culture, in sports, the same faces. There's not so much new blood because Israelis, as I said, are conservative with a small c. And Netanyahu knows this very well. Netanyahu plays on this, that only I can be prime minister. There is this feeling. I've spoken to people who can't give me a good reason why they'd vote Netanyahu, but they say, I don't think anyone else in this country can run it. And I say to them, well, aren't you doing a disservice to 9 million people, saying that not a single other person could run this country? But he's engendered this feeling, again, through a very clever campaign, that he is the only one who can run this country. And if he wasn't at the helm, Lord knows what would happen with Iran, with the coronavirus, with our economy. I mean, these are messaging points which are repeated again and again and again. And he's simply just a much better campaigner than everyone else.
He is an extraordinary campaigner. First of all, if you think about it, to underscore a point we made earlier about him serving now 13 consecutive years, but 15 years total, there are basically anyone under 18 who has an historic perspective doesn't know a prime minister other than Benjamin Netanyahu. No, they don't vote yet, but that's the sense. And the other parallel polls continue to show, which should be intuitive, that Netanyahu is the most qualified. Of course he is. He's been here doing his job the longest.
Incumbency, in any campaign, incumbency is a massive advantage. It can also be a challenge, but it's a massive advantage because quite simply, you're able to dictate the agenda. And in any election, I always say to my clients, if you're responding, you're losing. If you control the agenda, you win the elections. And Netanyahu knows how to control the agenda. Even when there's negative things in the press, he gets ahead of them by, I say, the number one rule of Netanyahu, as many, he's not unique in this, is distract and deflect. And he's the master of that.
He is indeed. I wrote an article maybe a month ago and making an analogy between Israel and the abused spouse. Because like you said, we keep justifying him, we keep voting him back, we keep but we continue to say, oh well, there are problems. Sure, there are problems, and as you said at the outset of the conversation, this is really a referendum on him. What will come is fascinating. Something you reminded me that, yesterday, today, it's kind of hard to keep up with the news cycle of all of the election things going on. Bibi came out with a statement that he, very circuitous, He said that he has people he's been speaking to both in Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope party and Naftali Bennett's Yamina party who will defect basically and come and support him in order to help get the 61 seats. Now, I've thought this election that in fact it's Gideon Sa'ar who has the better opportunity to say that to newly elected Likud members if it seems that they might be able to form a coalition without Bibi as prime minister and get 4, 5, 6, 7 Likud members to defect and support a right-wing leadership of Sa'ar and or Naftali Bennett. Do you think the notion of people jumping ship between parties is realistic, and which would you put your money on?
Well, first of all, we saw it in the last elections. We saw the big blue and white party, which gained a majority of seats, was basically broken up into its two relatively equal parts, into Yesh Atid and blue and white of Benny Gantz, and he suffered, and he's continuing to suffer for it. What we have to bear in mind is, according to the law, it has to be at least a third of the party to break away.
As a faction.
Right. So you can't take one or two. You have to take at least a third of the law. So if Likud get 30, you would need to take 10.
10. That's hard.
Which is unlikely. The fact is, and again, someone who spends a lot of time in the Knesset, there are a lot of people on that Likud list who are not big fans of Netanyahu, who are just waiting for that day after Netanyahu. But they know at the moment he not only controls the government, he also controls the Likud party very strongly. One thing that he did in recent years is he made sure that he controlled all the party committees. That's why Danny Danon was sent off to New York to be the ambassador, because he controlled some very important Likud committees. And that's why, while other parties are having primaries in between all these elections and leadership races, the Likud doesn't need to, because Netanyahu gets ahead of it and makes sure that there aren't any, because he controls all the important committees within his own party. So there's very little dispute of that. So there is a lot of people in the Likud who are dissatisfied with Netanyahu, but they know at this point they can't make a move on him because he just, like Gideon Sa'ar did. Gideon Sa'ar did try and take him on the leadership and failed. And that's one of the reasons why he decided to create a new party. So anyone looking at that will say, Gideon Sa'ar, who was at least a very popular member of the Likud, if he couldn't, struggle to make any inroads against Bibi, I'm not going to have, too much success. So a lot of people are just waiting for that. Cool. As I said, even if he loses the elections, by the way, he may not resign. Again, losing the elections is, subjective, exactly, because it's more about whoever's able to form a government. But as I said, Bibi is a step ahead of a lot of these, and that's why he keeps in line. He makes sure that anyone who is getting too much power in the Likud either gets pushed to the back. There's some very talented people in the Likud who are not made ministers in the last election, in the last Knesset. Sa'ar would be one. Nir Barkat, the very popular former mayor of Jerusalem, after being told by Bibi very publicly that he would be the next finance minister, found himself to be a backbencher because he's probably the greatest threat at this point. And Gilad Erdan, who was another threat, is now our ambassador to Washington and to the UN in New York. So Bibi knows exactly how to divide and conquer very well, and that's why he promotes backbenchers to be ministers if they show loyalty to him. So it's a very clever tactic, as I said, a very strategic person who really gets ahead of threats within the government, but also within his own party. So I don't see too many people leaving the Likud at this point. I'm sure I can guarantee that there is a list somewhere in one of Bibi's offices of all the names of potential defectors, and I'm sure they have been working on them. And it's certainly after the elections, they'll be working on them very, very hard. I know for a fact that that there's many people that he has who make informal contacts with many of these people to seek them out to say, what could we offer you? Because we talked about Amir Peretz defecting from Labour. There were 2 seats that came from the Labour Party to the government, and they were both given relatively nice ministries. I mean, that's quite remarkable that a two-seat party got two ministries. That doesn't add up. And then you have what's it called, Zwicke Hauser and Joas Hento. What's their party called? I can't remember what their party called. Again,
Derech Eretz.
Derech Eretz. One of them was given a ministry, a very good ministry of communications. The other was made head of probably the most powerful committee in the Knesset, which is the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Again, two seats. And that showed basically that Netanyahu knows what to do and he knows how to offer. And, don't forget that as much as he has to give over these ministries, and Yesh Atid in the end only brought 16 seats to the coalition, and they were given something like 8 ministries, disproportionate. So there was a lot of Likud people who were very dissatisfied when they worked hard to get those seats. When they reached 35 seats, they were given the same amount of ministries as a party of 16.
Right.
So there's a lot of dissatisfied people with the Likud of this situation, and they know, and they're just waiting for that. But there is always that but with Bibi. They know at the moment he's, only if he loses or if he's not able to form a government and someone else is, that's a point where he could be weak enough to topple within the party. But at that point has not come yet.
Got it. That's all excellent. And as you're speaking, Ashley, I'm going off on about 100 tangents that we could have another hour conversation on. We're not going to have a chance to do that now. I'm seeing questions, so that's great. And I'm going to try and weave your questions in, but definitely please, folks, continue to ask your questions by the chat. We'll maybe a couple more formal questions with Ashley and then open it up if any of you have questions. You were speaking before, among other things, Ashley, about the parties that are hovering on the threshold that may or may not make it, and 4 or 5 of them probably somewhere in that range. One of them is an Arab party, Ram, that broke off from what's still called the Joint List, and in our current Knesset is the third largest party. For those who don't know, Israeli Arabs represent about 20% of the population, and it's a fascinating dynamic. I don't know how much we can go into right now, Ashley, but basically, as I'm understanding it, you have the Joint List, which has operated as a faction of 4 parties that decided to come together and run as a unit in order that they all should rise above the threshold. And for a couple of elections, that worked super well, getting them to 15 seats and becoming the 3rd largest party or group in the Knesset. And now you've got Ram, which is an Islamist party headed by a guy named Mansour Abbas, who's broken away and then basically said, no, we want to be part of the state. We don't want to be with all of these rejectionists who even vote against the peace accords. So if Ram is one of those parties that's teetering around 4 seats and could get in, and he's saying he actually could support even a Netanyahu government, which would presume that he would support another government as well. What are your thoughts on that? Have we crossed the red line that has informally existed, that Arab parties never formally backed a government, except I think for maybe at least once back with Yitzhak Rabin, maybe that was
on the outside.
On the outside. But what do you think about what's the Arab vote? How does that play out this time?
Well, that's really one of the fascinating elements and even unprecedented elements of these elections, that the Arab parties, as you said, used to run separately, but as the threshold was raised, they realized they needed to run together. And just like on the, let's say, Jewish majoritarian side, the Arabs are not obviously all of one mind on all issues. They basically break down into 3 groupings. Maybe I'm doing them an injustice, and this could probably take a whole hour to discuss this, which we're not going to do. But the 3 groupings invariably are the nationalists, the really hardcore anti-Zionists, will not recognize the state, although they have to run in the Israeli elections, you have to recognize Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and they give lip service to it, but really these are people who, are very problematic and care more about the Palestinians than they even do their own people. Another party is...
but actually, just a second. You say they care more about the Palestinians than they do their own people. You mean they care more about Palestinian Arabs who are not citizens and live in Gaza versus Israeli Arabs who are citizens? Okay.
Exactly. And another grouping is Hadash, which is the Communist Party, which always has a Jewish member to show it's not religiously affiliated, even though it's within the Arab grouping. And the other is Ram, which is the Islamist, which is extremely religious Muslims. And basically, what's been happening is in Arab society, there's been many different movements. One of the movements is it's time that we became part of Israeli society. We became part of the government. We became part of the decision-making process because there are issues here which we care about. We should just care about what's going on in the Palestinian Authority. We should just care about what Mahmoud Abbas is doing. We should care because they have many issues. And one of the biggest issues for the Palestinian public, in fact, I saw a poll the other day, and they gave a list of like 10 issues, and one issue stood up 5 times as greatly as any other issue, is policing and crime. Right. We're hearing on the news almost every single night Arab on Arab violence. In Arab majority cities and towns, especially in the north, people are scared to walk the streets. Arabs are scared to walk the streets because there's shootings, there's gang violence, mafias, all sorts of problems, and they feel that they're not being policed well enough. They don't have the budgets that some of the Jewish majoritarian cities have. So that's become a massive issue, one that many Arabs are feeling that their parties, their representatives in Knesset haven't done enough about. So we see for the first time, well, not the first time, but Netanyahu, again, reading the map, understands this. Netanyahu's got a very good American pollster who's polling all the time. So he understood maybe there's a couple of seats there. And in an election where every single seat counts, Netanyahu believes that he can get 3 or 4 seats, which would be unprecedented for Likud or a right of center party, from the Arab streets. So he suddenly found budgets of tens of millions of shekels to create more police stations, greater policing. And we've definitely seen that the joint Arab list has suffered. I mean, even without Ram, they're still doing worse than they were. But what we have seen is Ram, this Islamist party, you think probably the least likely, is for the first time hasn't ruled out recommending Prime Minister Netanyahu to the president. We spoke about how each leader of the party will go to the president's house, be invited, and no Arab party has ever recommended certainly a right-wing prime minister. So the fact that Ram haven't ruled it out, and even there are discussions, and there are certainly contacts between Mansour Abbas and Netanyahu, we could be in this unprecedented situation where Ram could be part of the government, although that would obviously displease some of Netanyahu's more right-wing elements, which he's also got to bring in. We haven't spoken about them, but there's this party called the National Religious Party, which has elements which are the most extreme on the right. Some of them, being called fascist, racist, or whatever. So for them to sit in a government with Islamist Arabs, neither side would probably not only welcome, but both of them have ruled it out. So, but again, we're talking about Bibi, and maybe there is a way he can figure this out. But certainly we're seeing a lot of unprecedented forces, and we're seeing an Arab public who are fed up. They're fed up with their leaders who they feel don't represent them. Their day-to-day business is making money, being safe, just like anyone else.
Right.
And they feel that their representatives are not doing enough. So in comes Netanyahu and says, you know what, you may not love my views on the Palestinian issue, you may not love, but I'm going to bring you budgets. I'm going to solve some of the issues. Another element, as I said, we could go on about this for an hour. A lot of Arab Israelis are actually quite positive about the Abraham Accords, about the normalization agreements. I went to Dubai a couple of months ago, and half of my plane was Israeli Arabs. Dubai has become a little playground for many of them. And it sort of broke that paradigm that there's an Israel-Arab conflict. The Israel-Arab conflict in the last few months certainly has ended. And the fact that Israel is so warmly welcoming, Arab countries has sort of made a lot of Arabs think, well, maybe it's not about Arabs and Jews. Maybe there's, there is something positive about this process. So that's also, warmed Netanyahu in the eyes of certain Arabs. Again, he's not going to win the majority in that public, but even if he manages to win, according to polls that I've heard, he's probably got at least 1 seat from the Arab public at this point. He's hoping for 3 or 4. I'm not sure he'll get there, but every seat will count.
But, and as you said, with regard to the current failed government where two parties representing two people each got unprecedented number of seats and influence within the government. Imagine if according to some headline that I read the other day, if this tie between the pro-Bibi camp and the anti-Bibi camp, if the outcome is 58-58, and Mansour Abbas with Ram comes in with 4 seats, he becomes
the kingmaker,
big-time kingmaker.
And by the way, that poll has happened. That poll has happened 58-58.
Right.
With him passing with 4 seats. It's entirely possible. So he would be the most, addressed person in the country. Everybody would be calling him.
Right.
And offering him
everything.
Half the kingdom, as they say.
Everything. Right. In order to get, and in a sense, that's good for the Israeli Arabs, who have had really bad representation all these years, and as you said, are in many ways like the rest of us. We're across the spectrum, but we all just want to live and get along in our lives. And certainly when you see the Joint List voting against the Abraham Accord and peace with the Arabs, that's almost worse than when you had Knesset members on the Turkish boats coming here trying to break the Gaza blockade. Really crazy. Let's just shift a little bit and maybe wrap up. So friends, I want to ask for any other questions, and I'm going to try and weave a couple of your questions that I've seen both on Facebook and on Zoom together. Not just as we discussed before that Bibi served as prime minister for about 20% of the years of independence, and most young people under 18 don't know a different prime minister, but most of our friends watching, right? We have an historic, and since I think probably it's safe to say, as most of our programs are, most of our friends are Christians. Netanyahu has been uniquely welcoming of Christian support, calling Christians our best friends, and indeed that is a truism. So thank you for that, everybody. And so I get contacted all the time by Christian friends saying, oh, you have to support Netanyahu. It would be horrible, because they can't imagine him not being prime minister because he is the leader. Now, our friend and advisory board member Dave Pitcher asked a question, what other candidates have the best chance to further peace with neighboring countries? I'd like to weave that into a more global question for you, Ashley, and it's kind of a lot. If it's not Bibi, if it's not Bibi, how do you see the election of someone new impacting the peace process, the Abraham Accords, which of course has a direct relationship to the Biden administration now, and how will it relate to the U.S. administration and Western allies itself? And the big question, of course, is security vis-a-vis Iran, which is one of the things, of course, drawing us and our new Arab allies together. What are your thoughts on it's a big question.
Right, it's a very big question, and again, a subject which could take an hour in itself. But I can tell you, working in the foreign ministry, 10 years ago, we were having these conversations with our Gulf allies behind the scenes. There was a joke in the foreign ministry that we were the mistress of the region. Everyone would turn to us at nighttime and then deny in the morning that they even, spoke to us. That was our role. But I can tell you the trigger really for the Abraham Accords was President Obama. President Obama's outreach to Iran, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, really just formulated the fact that the Middle East is no longer Jews on one side, Arabs on the others. It's about extremists led by the Iranian bloc, the Shiite, Hezbollah and other parties. And on the other side is, I wouldn't say necessarily moderate, because that's obviously a very subjective term, but I would say pragmatic, led by the Sunni Gulf nations. And they found themselves on the same side as Israel, not just on the Iranian issue, on issues with ISIS, also, Israel and Saudi Arabia, two countries, and Egypt, you could argue, that felt slighted by President Obama. So the relationship certainly was emboldened, not by President Obama, but despite President Obama. With President Trump coming in, there was an opportunity to really bring these things out in the open. And what we saw was that each country gained something from the Abraham Accords, whether it was the F-35s in UAE, Sudan coming off the terrorist list, recognition of Western Sahara with Morocco, et cetera, et cetera. So Israel, to a certain extent, was a little bit of a bridesmaid here with the Abraham Accords. Netanyahu certainly was not against it. He was certainly an advocate for it, but it was led largely by President Trump and his team, a Middle East team, people like Kushner and others. But there was a tremendous opportunity. And I think that the status quo had to end because more and more Arab leaders or Arab officials were being seen alongside Israeli officials. So the next step was these open relationships. Not to get involved in American politics, but certainly if President Trump would have won the election, I think we'd have seen a few more normalization agreements. There was talk of Indonesia, of a few others. That would have been big, because that's the most populous Muslim country in the world. Mauritania was another one. I think Saudi Arabia is not a million miles away, but I think now the Biden administration has no great interest in it. It's working its way back into this concept of linkage. Linkage is this concept which was very much touted by many American administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, which means that everything in the Middle East, all the problems and challenges of the Middle East, all go through Ramallah and Jerusalem. In other words, if you solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, then all the region's problems become much easier. I mean, that's obviously untrue with the civil war in Syria and Yemen and Lebanon and all these others. It has nothing to do with it. But now we see a return to that failed thinking. To a certain extent, we will see a greater focus on the Palestinian issue, even though it becomes no easier to solve as it has for the last since Oslo, 28 years. So I don't think there'll be that focus, and I think you need that focus from the Americans to push these normalization agreements through, because, as I said, President Trump really sweetened the deal, as it were, to make it worth these countries' while to do it. And I think while Biden will not negate any nation who comes forward and says, I'd like to normalize with Israel, they certainly won't make it easier for them or give them anything to do it. And when it comes to Iran, the fact that there's talk of returning to the JCPOA worries the Gulf countries even more than Israel. They are on the front lines. Israel, not to say Israel's secondary, because we are, at the end of the day, according to the Ayatollahs, the little Satan, to the US's great Satan. But Saudi Arabia is extremely wide. And don't forget, Saudi Arabia is fighting Iranian proxies on a day-to-day basis, the Houthis in Yemen and elsewhere. So there'll definitely, there's a lot of cooperation, a lot of coordination. It'll become more and more open, but I don't see an American administration, this particular American administration, really pushing these normalization agreements forward. So I don't think it matters who's really in the Prime Minister's office in Israel. I think the American, Biden is, President Biden has surrounded himself with many sort of former Obama people, and the Obama administration and Netanyahu did not see eye to eye, to put it extremely mildly. So there's no love lost for Bibi in Washington at this point. So it's going to be a difficult time for Bibi over the next 4 years, if he continues over the next 4 years. I think if someone else came in, they would get a chance to sort of start from scratch with the Biden administration. Whether that will be helpful or not is certainly open to debate.
And to what extent the Biden administration is even receptive. If it's not even on the priority, then you can have a new start, but that really won't matter.
I think we can see the fact that the Biden administration is the first one in quite a few that has not appointed a Middle East envoy, which shows, I think that they will return. There was a memo that was leaked to the National, which is a paper out of the Emirates, which basically had a memo on a Palestinian-American reset, where we're going to see some steps a little bit lower down that will be taken back towards the Palestinians. They want to reset, what they call a reset from the Trump administration, which was a lot harder on the Palestinians. Some of them are talking about point of origin labeling, which is something the Europeans do, which would certainly be not received well in Israel. So we can see that probably what will happen is a lot of steps which will irritate Jerusalem, which will be problematic for Jerusalem, but I don't see any great grandiose peace conferences or statements to that effect in the coming months.
That's great. So, and it's, by the way, not to get onto a tangent, because I could spend days talking about the Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Authority, but it's ironic because they're supposed to have 2 elections this year. It's theoretically for the parliament in May, and then sometime in the summer for their president. And what I'd read is that the idea of having these elections, the first in 15 years, was as part of that reset to show that there are some sort of democratic principles. And just this week, I read something that now Israel and the Biden administration are trying to get them to withdraw having those elections, because it seems obvious, certainly for the parliamentary election, that Hamas will win. And not only is that not good for any of this, but should we be doomed to a 5th election next fall, that will obviously have a big impact on the outcome of the 5th election. But we're not here to talk about the 5th election.
If these elections go through, it's not a given. We've got to this level before and elections were put off again. It may well happen, but it's certainly not a definite. We're not talking about the most democratic institution. I mean, yes. Mahmoud Abbas is 16 years into a 4-year term, so he doesn't have the greatest interest in gambling. Another 16 years on a 4-year term. So
not at 86 years
to be seen,
or however old he is. So actually, I have one more question, friends. I want to ask you if you've got questions. Let's get them ready. But okay, so pretend it's a Friday night. You and I are sitting next to each other, whispering 2 rows from the back of the sanctuary, and I say, "Okay, Ashley, everything you said tonight. It's more than intuitive. It's insightful, and just shows how well versed you are, and you're really processing this. It's not a linear thing." And it's actually given me a great new insight and appreciation for you and what you do. But what's the game changer? What's the thing? What's the Ashley Perry game changer that others aren't talking about for the election next week?
The undecideds. There's a larger amount of undecideds in these elections than there've been for quite a while. Now, as I said, my bottom principle is never bet against Bibi. But, and this is my theory, again, Bibi is doing very well in really reducing the threat from the other right-wing parties from across the aisle, whether it's Yamina or Gideon Sa'ar. But if you think about it, an undecided person is a person who's deciding between 2, maybe 3 parties. So they're usually deciding between like parties. Likud doesn't really have a like party. Ideologically, it does in Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett's party. But if you're voting for one of them, invariably you will not, at this point, like Bibi. And suddenly, to change your mind in the last few days, yes, there will be some, but there won't be large amounts. So I think that we may well see a bit more support for some of these other parties. Again, if people who are deciding between Labour and Meretz will be an undecided person. You're not going to go from Meretz all the way over to the other side or something like that. And maybe between the ultra-Orthodox parties or, there is no like party to Likud. Netanyahu knows exactly where he can get votes, and he knows at this point probably his best bet on trying to pull votes away is Naftali Bennett, because that's the most likely to be as Sa'ar, Lieberman, Lapid, and other voters. So it makes sense for him really to try and focus, which he has been doing, on Yamina. Hear me?
Yes, sort of. I don't know if it's my network or yours. Folks, do you hear me? Dave Garmas, I see you. Can you just nod if you're hearing me okay? Yeah. Do you hear Ashley?
Okay. Hi.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
I think the undecided will be the ones, as I said, this election will be won by thousands of votes. It won't be the millions, it won't be the hundreds of thousands, it won't be the tens of thousands. There'll be thousands of people who would decide whether a party goes over the threshold or not. And that is the game changer. As I said, if I was a betting man, I certainly wouldn't bet against Bibi because, as I said, he will not win the elections, but he could easily win the coalition negotiations afterwards. But it's very evenly put. The other question is, what will happen on the day of it?
What will happen on what, Ashley? I don't think. Oh, okay. We're missing the best part.
Hello?
Yeah,
Hi.
there we go. You said what will happen on the
on the day of elections. Usually, anyone who works in elections knows that the day of the elections is so important. We call it GOTV, get out the vote, because that's really, election can be won and lost on the day. And that's why wherever you are, a campaign can use as much as half of its budget just on the.
I think we're getting the point, but I think Ashley.
Hello.
There we go. You said wherever you are, the campaign's using half its budget.
Right. It could use half or a third, but a very significant amount of its budget on the day. Getting people to vote, making sure your opponent's suppressing their vote, whatever it is, all these different tricks that you use. What Netanyahu does very well is he used what in Israel is a Yiddish term called gewalt, which is, how do you translate that? Translate it like shock.
Alarmist. I mean, it's not
alarmist. A few elections ago, he basically put out a message on the day of the elections: we're going to lose power because the Arabs are being bussed into the voting stations, and anyone who doesn't vote will ensure that the right wing will not maintain its power. And it worked.
On the day of, right? That was late afternoon.
And this was, and I know for a fact that this was a strategy that was coordinated weeks in advance. It was not due to any actual facts. And we actually saw afterwards that the numbers didn't suddenly go up from the Arab communities, but it was an extremely powerful message. And I can tell you how many people fell for that. I'm sure we all know people who fell for that. So Netanyahu knows very well, and I'm sure he's got a message to drive his supporters, to motivate his supporters, to excite his supporters, maybe even to put off other supporters. He's certainly, he's been able to do that also with his fake cameras in the election booths in the past. He's been doing a few things. So he has a very good strategy for the day of the elections. And that could be one seat here, one seat there, and that could change the whole map. This is going to come down to extremely narrow numbers. Once he gets this 61, he could then bring in other parties, because other parties will say, well, in Israel, the opposition is relatively weak. If you're in the opposition, there's not much you can do. So some of the opposition parties, once it's known that he will get his 61, could jump on, and eventually he could get 70 seats or whatever it is. But to get to that 61 will certainly be a challenge, but you don't rule out PB.
Okay.
That's the bottom line.
That's this is a great insight. I want to open for general questions, but before we do, I just want to encourage people watching, whether you're on Facebook. If you're on Facebook now, please be sure to share this. It's good stuff. And if you're watching from Zoom, then have a look later, or when we upload it to YouTube as well, and definitely share this. Before we just wrap up with Jerome Baxley joining us at the end, does anyone have any more questions that have not been answered? Once, twice. Okay. On that note, Jerome, why don't you turn your microphone on? And while you do that, I just want to welcome you. We've actually never met in person, but you've been on a lot of these programs, and for as long as I can remember, sitting in Alabama, doing some incredible things connected with Israel, supporting a wide range of organizations that are about Israel, including the Genesis 123 Foundation, for which we're grateful. Jerome, I'd love to ask you to, before I do the wrap-up announcements, if you would, to close us out in prayer.
Be honored to. Our dear Heavenly Father, we just come to you right now in all of your majesty. We thank you for your love for the Jewish people. You created these people for a reason, to let the world know about your majesty, and we thank you for that. I pray to God for wisdom in voting. Your word says that you put people in charge. You put kings where they belong to be, and you'll have your men running Israel. And I pray to God that for wisdom, though, for people as they vote. I pray to God that the United States would stand by Israel. I'm so afraid with our government, we're heading in the wrong direction. But I pray to God for the United States to stand behind Israel. They'll always be there. Your word promises that, and I thank you for that. Thank you for your love for them, your love for me, which blows my mind. Pray to God you would just help each one of us to be the witness, be the blessing that we can to each other. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Friends, I'm thrilled you all joined us. I'm glad I got to share my friend Ashley Perry with you tonight, and so you have an understanding of why I always look forward to those Friday nights. And you got a lot of information today. We could spend between tonight and the end of the election on Tuesday and keep talking, and we still wouldn't have covered enough with Ashley. So Ashley, thank you for joining us tonight, for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
Just to wrap up, for those who came in late, I'd love for next week we begin a 4-part series, part of the global Passover prayer for Israel. Fabulous sessions that we're just now beginning to publicize. It's already on the Facebook page. You'll be getting emails about this. Certainly feel free to contact me. I hope you'll join us. And the thing I'm really passionate about, there are a lot of them, but our program Verses for Zion, everyone here has children and grandchildren, or neighbors who have children and grandchildren, who need to have a more substantive connection with Israel. Yes, pray for us, and yes, be connected to us. But I'd love for you to refer people to join us in the Verses for Zion program, and let your children and grandchildren actually learn through studying the Bible why Israel is in fact so important. Not because I say so, not because Ashley or any of you say so, but because God says so. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Ashley, go get some sleep. I'm sure you got a couple more webinars this week. Have a good night and rest of the day, everybody. God bless.